But I guess I wanted to start off by saying why I'm not going to present on prohibition today, and that's simply because I don't have enough time. I barely have enough time to squeeze in everything I want to talk about today as far as sacramental uses of cannabis, and I would get really fired up and pissed off if I talked about prohibition for too long, which I am inevitably going to have to do in the course of this dialogue. But what I'm really trying to do is demonstrate that humans have had a symbiotic relationship with the cannabis plant for at least 5,000 years that we know of, recorded history. And given the biological evidence of the endocannabinoid receptor system, dedicated receptor system attuned to cannabis throughout our bodies, it's likely that relationship has been much, much longer for our nervous system to literally adapt to the presence of this plant in our lives. I will mention medical use as well, but I have decided to focus on the sacramental uses of cannabis because I believe that might be the oldest use of cannabis, and it's more in alignment with where the Erie Conference is going and my goal of identifying cannabis as a sacred plant teacher that should be held in reverence with all the other plant teachers that my colleagues are going to be talking about today. So, this image really says it best for me. This is Alex Gray's image of the goddess Cannabia. He created this painting for the High Times Cannabis Cup in 1998 and has since been used for various rave flyers and posted on MySpace pages and whatnot. It's become a graphic meme of the spirit of the cannabis plant, and I really appreciate the name Goddess Cannabia as well. I think it's very apropos. That's another image by Alex Gray of Cannabia dancing, and kind of points in the direction of where I'll start talking about sacramental uses of cannabis throughout history, which is in ancient India. Cannabis was actually referred to as the nectar of Shiva, and it was in India that we have the origins of the practice of hash making, the hash itself being the nectar of Shiva. This is an image that reportedly depicts Shiva making a drink called bhang, which is spelled B-H-A-N-G. It was a milk drink, sweet and savory beverage that used cannabis extraction with the fatty lipids and was consumed orally. It's actually one of the oldest methods of consuming cannabis that we know of. And there's a company called Irish Moss today that makes a very similar product and provides it in the medical clubs. Here's a book that was written on the relationship between Shiva and cannabis and devotees of Shiva in India. Here's a picture of an Indian sadhu smoking cannabis. Another one. This is a sadhu who is making hash, possibly to be used in the extraction process of making the milk drink bhang. And it's also in India that we have the origins of the other bong, B-O-N-G, the water pipe. That was also created in India. I've seen pictures, I couldn't find one, of a giant wine barrel with a big hookah stem coming out of it, and a guy standing there smoking out of it. And here's a stylized modern interpretation of Shiva behind a cannabis leaf, holding a bong, a pair of scissors, a lighter, and a bag. And there's some interesting news in the last few years coming out of China. They found mummified bodies there, 3,000 and 4,000 years old, that contain pouches of dried cannabis flowers and seeds and leaves. In fact, there was one that earned the name Mick Mummy because it was found in the Gobi Desert region and actually had red hair and was wearing a kilt and was carrying about 4 or 5 grams of dried cannabis. Turning to ancient Greece, one of our adjunct faculty members from CIIS, Marguerite Rigoglioso, published a book in 2009 called The Divine Birth Cults of Ancient Greece. There were worshippers and devotees of all the Greek gods that practiced embodying those gods in the flesh and then practicing sacred sexuality with the express purpose of birthing divine children or demigods. And that's where we get the myths such as Hercules and Perseus. And Rigoglioso found evidence that the divine birth cult of Hera used the cannabis plant as a sacrament and called it asterion. specifically as a medicine for initiating channeling and mediumship in order to embody gods and goddesses and engage in these practices. One of the most interesting stories that has surfaced in recent years is of the Dogon tribe in Africa. These are people who claim to have an unbroken oral tradition extending back 150,000 years. And they engage in these intricate dances with these headpieces which are intended to honor their ancestors, whom they claim came from the Sirius star system. The Sirius star you may know as the dog star. It's a bright blue star that you can see in the summer sky. It's visible right now. It's actually a binary star system, and the Dogon tribe people's myths tell of the superdensity of one of those stars, as well as its very existence, which was only confirmed by modern astronomy in 1970. And indigenous researchers who interacted with these people at the turn of the last century heard these stories about this star. They actually say that it's a trinary star system. The third star has yet to be confirmed by modern telescopes. I just wanted to add, has anybody here seen the remake of the new Battlestar Galactica? Raise your hands. Yeah. Anybody intend on seeing it? Well, this meme about cannabis coming to the planet Earth by beings from the Sirius star system actually worked its way into the plot of that show in a very interesting way. So if you get a chance, I highly recommend it. The show also brings up a lot of discussions about fate versus destiny and polytheism versus monotheism. Here is an engraving intended to show the Dogon people with their ancestors. It's an Egyptian engraving. This is the Egyptian goddess Seshet, who is said to have, or appears to have, a cannabis leaf above her head. And here is another Babylonian engraving, actually, of the Tree of Life that looks oddly like the cannabis plant. And some people have even speculated that cannabis might be the tree of life that's said to grow along the banks of the river in paradise that's mentioned in Revelation chapter 22, verses 1 through 9. The tree of life which grows along the banks of the river and bears 26 different kinds of fruit. And I'll refer us to a slide at the end of my presentation that shows the several dozen different industrial applications of cannabis. It truly does bear 26 different kinds of fruit. There's also a passage in Exodus chapter 30, verses 22 through 25 that gives the recipe for the holy anointing oil that was used to anoint the kings of Israel, including Jesus the Christ. And it calls for, and I quote, the flowering tops of 6 cannabis plants. And that is thought by many to be cannabis. The word canobos actually means the two-dog plant. Canna being canine and bay or bis being two. It's a Greek etymology and similar to the cannabosum that's said to have been an ingredient in the oil used to anoint Jesus the Christ. Out of Africa also came the tradition of Rastafarianism that's said to be descended from King Haile Selassie. The Rastafarians actually believe that they're the lost 13th tribe of Judah, descended from the offspring of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. That claim hasn't received a lot of weight from the orthodoxy, but they nonetheless believe it very profoundly. And Rastafarian music has spread teachings of cannabis as a sacrament, as a medicine, and as a means of enjoyment and happiness around the world. And Bob Marley may be the most famous, but other people like Peter Tosh and Toots and the Maytals and a whole host of music has been inspired by this sacred plant. And it's been one of the main mediums that has really brought it into the mainstream of the West. But America, our country itself, has actually had a long-standing relationship with the cannabis plant. It has had industrial purposes throughout all of known history, including clothing, textiles, and rope. And in fact, nearly all the plantation owners, the tobacco plantation owners in the colonies, grew cannabis. They were actually required to grow a 1/4 acre of cannabis for the government specifically. Most of them grew quite a bit more. It was a lucrative crop. It was used to make sails, clothing, mainly rope. Cannabis hemp was literally a household name until about 100 years ago. It's also worth noting that cotton was a luxury back then. Most common people still wore burlap or hemp. It's actually a grossly inefficient crop. It is extremely painful to harvest. It creates these little tiny puffs of fiber inside this spiky death trap that looks like an artichoke heart from hell. And the fingers of the slaves would literally bleed to the knuckle until they became so callous that they could do that day in and day out. In fact, the only reason we still have cotton as a crop today is because Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1856. And it was basically required a mass slave culture to cultivate up until that point. And a number of the tobacco plantation owners, as I said, also grew cannabis hemp. The slaves would congregate at the end of their workday around campfires. They would smoke cannabis and sing songs. And that was the earliest origin of the racial bias against cannabis and the first impetus towards making it illegal. It was, in fact, the Jim Crow laws in the South that drove the emerging jazz culture and cannabis that was associated with it north towards Chicago. And Louis Armstrong, perhaps the most famous jazz musician and cannabis smoker, they were called vipers back then. And yeah, the relationship with jazz and cannabis and its travel to the Chicago area is entirely due to cannabis prohibition. So what started happening along with these racial biases in the early 1900s is someone patented a cotton gin for hemp that would separate the usable materials of the hemp plant mechanically. Popular Mechanics wrote this article in 1938 about the new billion-dollar cash crop. Even into the early 40s, people like Henry Ford were discussing the industrial applications of hemp. And at the same time, DuPont Chemicals was licensing or had patented the sulfuric acid process that turns wood pulp into paper. Also contributes to most of our groundwater pollution. Meanwhile, William Randolph Hearst also had significant investments in the lumber industry and the paper manufacturing industry. Those two teamed up. Hearst used his newspaper empire to spread propaganda regarding cannabis. And in 1937, Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Stamp Act. Never had any intention of issuing any tax stamps. And this was the kind of propaganda that they used to get this law passed. The American Medical Association actually perjured itself before Congress in 1937, lying about the deleterious effects of cannabis and it would make you go crazy and all that shit. Not 5 years later, we saw a complete reversal during World War II, where farmers were asked to grow hemp for the war, and a few tax stamps were actually issued up until about 1945, and then they were all cut off. This is a personal favorite of mine, I just kind of threw in there. In 1969, Dr. Timothy Leary filed a lawsuit that was eventually heard by the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court declared the original Marijuana Tax Stamp Act unconstitutional. So for about 2 years, cannabis was technically legal under federal law, but there were so many state and local regulations that it was largely a symbolic victory. Tricky Dick, Richard Nixon, then lobbied Congress to pass the Controlled Substances Act of 1971 and include cannabis as a Schedule I drug with a high potential for abuse and no medicinal value. Cocaine and heroin were added to Schedule II. I heard an interesting story. Well, basically what was going on here is Richard Nixon's most outspoken opponents were also users of cannabis. So he coined the phrase war on drugs and basically set about this culture war attacking his most outspoken opponents. I heard an interesting story that I haven't been able to confirm yet, that these guys, the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, which was a commune down in Southern California, was importing tons upon tons of cannabis flowers and hashish and using the money from selling it to finance the anti-war movement. Now this was just a story that popped up on a drug policy list I subscribed to, but it makes sense in a certain way, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was true. I just haven't had a chance to confirm it yet. So we now find cannabis existing mainly as a social sacrament today, and also as an alternative medicine. The medical marijuana movement's been growing in California and about 16 other states since 1996. There are some profiteers that have moved in that have helped trigger the federal backlash that we're experiencing currently. Representative Barney Frank, who is retiring, but he's the current Democratic representative from Massachusetts, has introduced H.R. 2306, ending federal marijuana prohibition. I was down at a rally a couple weeks ago in front of the City Hall with this sign that was given to me by Angel Raish, a patient who filed a lawsuit against John Ashcroft in 2002. It was heard by the Supreme Court, Gonzalez v. Raish, 2005. These are her cannabis wreaths down here in her handmade decoupage box as well. That's me smoking a joint in front of the Federal Building on Channel 2. That's a little bit bigger joint than the one I was smoking. That's a flyer for Barney Frank's bill, H.R. 2306, ending federal marijuana prohibition. We did jack all with that supermajority that we had back in 2009, so I don't expect it to see the full floor of Congress anytime soon. But this one is on its way. Tom Amiano's bill, AB 2306, which would create a state regulatory system for medical marijuana similar to the one Colorado has. Colorado has received just slightly less of a federal backlash for its medical marijuana program. We think that's largely because it's much more tightly regulated by the state. California, incidentally, has dropped the ball on getting a legalization initiative on the ballot for 2012. There were two competing initiatives that once again divided the movement, and just a lot of backtalk and nastiness on that drug policy list that I subscribe to. I'm really disappointed. My California pride is hurt. But Colorado got it together. Regulate marijuana like alcohol is on the ballot for 2012, and I expect that if it does pass, that they'll have a lot of fun slugging it out with the feds over the next couple of years. We have dispensaries opening up in Washington, D.C. We also have a WeGrow, weed-friendly hydroponics store that I worked for briefly, opening up in Washington, D.C., making a lot of press. This is going to be really interesting. The feds have already proven that they're not going to let it stand in California, so I think it's only a short matter of time before something happens in Washington, D.C. as well. Really, at the end of the day, federal prohibition of cannabis is not about public health or safety. It's about $25 billion a year spent on law enforcement and militarized police forces around the country. It's about big healthcare and big pharma and repressing the regulatory health benefits of cannabis as well as alternative treatments for cancer. It's about thought police and a substance that has been shown to stimulate free thinking and creativity. And it's about a government that is fundamentally incapable of admitting when it's wrong. Here's a flowchart created by a guy named Bradley Walker, who you can find on Facebook. I'm happy to send out digital copies of this as well. Shows all the industrial applications of cannabis as well as all of the major corporations that have vested interests in those areas. And you'll notice that medical is covered as well as industrial. So I wanted to fill in that last little part about sacramental uses. That's Richard Lee, who self-funded Prop 19, the legalization initiative in 2010. Oaksterdam University was raided on April 2nd. I was down there along with a few hundred other people. Blatant show of force and intimidation, totally politically motivated attack, obviously, because he was the major funder and backer of Prop 19. And he, as far as I know, has yet to be charged, but this man, Reverend Eddie Lepp, who's from Lake County, is still in federal custody. So is Mark Emery, who is a Canadian citizen, as well as Reverend Roger Christie, who was the founder of the THC Ministry, the Hawaiian Cannabis Ministry. These men and many other men and women are still wrongfully imprisoned for cannabis today, and it's something I've dedicated my life to seeing change. These are the cannabis laws in the United States as they currently stand. There are new laws being passed every year. There are 16 states that have legalized medical marijuana and dozens more that have decriminalized possession and adult use. Dozens of cities around the country have passed resolutions modeled on Oakland's Measure Z, which makes cannabis-related crimes a lowest law enforcement priority. Richard Lee argued that this also legalized adult sales. That's another one of the reasons he was targeted. But it literally means I could go outside and smoke a joint right now, and if someone's jaywalking or if the radio is saying anything else, cops are required by law to respond to that. It's another cannabis policy book, Moving Beyond Stalemate. Something else I would like to see happen. I think that cannabis will be legal someday. I think it may take a post-American epoch to see that happen, or at least a fundamental restructuring of the federal government. The Occupy movement and the growing financial crisis are evidence that people are ready for a change, and I believe that cannabis will continue to interact with us as a guide and a teacher, and for that, I'm very grateful. So, what can you do? Keep smoking, educate your friends about cannabis, and if you like, I have a referral for a doctor here in the city of San Francisco that can provide you with a legal medical cannabis recommendation. And I'm ready to take questions. Thank you, guys.
I just wonder why you and the others omit the Scythians and their use of cannabis as documented by Herodotus and journals, and they found these burials of kings with 30 to 50 pounds of weed that the psychoactive properties are no longer there, but it's still intact, and they're related to the people that wore the kilts and have the red hair. As well as another point, they just recently started to review a case on religious use of marijuana in the U.S. Have you seen that?
That's right. Thank you for bringing up both of those. The first one, the relationship of the Scythians to cannabis. I had come across it and flagged it. And
it's older than the Vedic culture.
Yeah, it was obviously very revered, and I have come across that research before, and I need to pay special attention to it because it was allegedly the Scythians that also taught King Arthur how to ride on stirrups on horses as well.
I don't know anything about that.
Yeah,
They,
it's an area of
to
interest.
domesticate the horse. So.
Yeah.
And marijuana.
Right. The second point you brought up was the Native American Church recently filed a lawsuit that's being, I think, is going to be heard by the Supreme Court regarding their sacramental use of cannabis. So thanks for throwing that one in as well.
Do you know any good literature on contemporary sacramental use? Anything anyone's written on contemporary sacramental cannabis use?
Yeah, there was a slide I threw in there of a book someone wrote on the connection between Shiva and cannabis, and there's a few others. I mean, most of what's being published right now is regarding medical use, because that is one of the fronts. But I have about almost a dozen digital resources I'd be happy to forward to you from this presentation. So I'll try and get an email list going around here, or if you want, just find me after the presentation and I'll do it digitally, save the tree. Any others? Yeah.
Is there a group organized in San Francisco that's sort of on the political side of this, supporting legalization or decriminalization, things like that, policy changes?
Yeah, there is actually. In response to the recent federal crackdown, threatening letters from the U.S. Attorney and the raid on Oaksterdam, Americans for Safe Access and a few other organizations have joined together to form a group called SF United, which is basically a coalition of cannabis activists that is lobbying the Board of Supervisors to institute an amnesty program, rapid re-permitting and reopening for the dispensaries in the city that have been shut down.
I want to share it. It's been over a year now ago that somebody tried to open a dispensary in the Sunset area, and there was a huge backlash from the supervisor. The supervisor organized a huge
Yeah, he's mentioning a dispensary that was tried to be open at 22nd and Terrebonne about a year and a half ago. I know the attorney who was working on the project, and I went to a couple of the planning commission meetings, and you know, major backlash from the NIMBYs, the not in my backyard people, and it's unfortunate that they've concentrated all the dispensaries downtown and in the Soma, and that even in the outer Mission, there's 3 new ones that are being opposed right now. There's literally nothing west of the Visadero anymore.
All right, that's time.
All right. Thanks, guys.